When we talk about an airline called ValueJet, besides a smiling cartoon airplane and its terrible safety records, there is one thing that immediately comes to our mind. That thing is, of course, the crash of ValueJet Flight 592. Within minutes after takeoff from Miami, the pilots of ValuJet DC-9 had faced their worst nightmare. A raging inferno inside the front cargo compartment had making its way into the cabin, rapidly filling the entire aircraft with toxic smoke. Will they be able to make it back before the fire completely consumed the aircraft? Let's find out. On May 11, 1996, it was a clear afternoon day at Miami International Airport in Florida. ValueJet Flight 592 is preparing for an hour-and-a-half flight to its destination in Atlanta, Georgia. ValueJet Airlines is a U.S. low-cost airline founded in 1992 and started its first flight in 1993 from Atlanta to Tampa. In 1994, it became the fastest airline to make a profit in the history of American aviation, with earnings of $21 million and with additional 15 aircraft to its fleet, most of which were second-hand McDonnell Douglas DC-9 from other airlines, making the fleet of ValueJet the oldest among other U.S. airlines of that time. Besides the fleet of aging aircraft, ValueJet also be famous for its aggressive cost-cutting measures, and its workers received minimal training, which led the airline to develop a low reputation for safety. Moreover, ValueJet had been involved in 2 major accidents. On June 8, 1995, ValueJet Flight 597 was forced to abort its takeoff, after the explosion of the right engine, due to rusted engine components. The shrapnel penetrated the fuselage and the right engine main fuel line, which resulted in a major cabin fire. The aircraft was destroyed without any fatalities. ValueJet had been aware of the problem, but didn't have the budget to fix it, and intentionally kept the aircraft flying. And on January 7, 1996, ValueJet Flight 558 suffered an excessively hard landing at Nashville Airport in Tennessee, due to pilot error and malfunction in the ground shift mechanism, which injured 5 people. Commanding Flight 592 is 35-year-old Captain Candelin Quebec, an experienced pilot with 8,928 total flight hours, including 2,116 hours on DC-9. Captain Quebec began her flying career with Eastern Airlines in 1989 as the first officer of Airbus A300 until the airline shut down. She then joined ValueJet in 1993, where she became a captain and flew DC-9. On her right side is 52-year-old First Officer Richard Hazen, a former U.S. Air Force pilot with 11,800 total flight hours and 2,148 hours on DC-9. The aircraft flying is a 27-year-old Douglas DC-9, registered as November 904 Victor Juliet, first flew with Delta Air Lines as November 1281 Lima from 1969 until being sold back to McDonnell Douglas in 1992, who then sold this aircraft to ValueJet 1 year later. While in operation with ValueJet, this aircraft had suffered a series of incidents in the 2 years before the crash, including 2 aborted takeoffs and 8 emergency landings. On the day of the accident, November 904 Victor Juliet, as ValueJet Flight 591 was delayed at Atlanta, due to the circuit breaker for the right auxiliary hydraulic pump had popped, which had been reset by a mechanic, and the aircraft departed at 11:25 a.m., 35 minutes behind schedule. Besides the popped circuit breaker, the aircraft's autopilot, public address system, and interphone, which pilots used to communicate with flight attendants inside the cabin, were inoperative. Once arriving in Miami, the mechanics from ValueJet's maintenance contractor, SaberTech, were able to bring the PA system back to working order, but the repair of the autopilot and interphone system could not be done in Miami, and this plane was given the okay to continue flying. Today's flight will be carrying 105 passengers, 2 flight crews, and 3 flight attendants, making a total of 110. Flight 592 has also been loaded with 4,109 pounds or 1,863 kilograms of cargo for a flight to Atlanta, which includes passengers' baggage, mail and company-owned materials or COMAT, consisting of 3 DC-9 tires, and 5 boxes labeled as oxy canisters, empty, which we will come back for these boxes later. At 2:04 p.m., Flight 592 takes off from Miami's runway 09er left. The aircraft began a normal climb to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet and headed northwest to its destination. As the autopilot is not working, Captain Quebec has to fly a plane manually for a return flight. Inside the cabin, the passengers began to settle down for 92 minutes flight to Atlanta. Everything was normal. Until at 2:10 p.m., both pilots heard a loud bang in their headsets and noticed that the plane began to lose electrical power. At the same time, the passengers started to smell smoke, and the fire had burned through the cabin floor, causing panic among the passengers. Both pilots then heard panicking sound from the cabin and realized what was going on. Captain Quebec began to turn her aircraft back to Miami, while First Officer Hazen declared an emergency.
Critter 592, contact Miami Center 13245. 592 needs a return to Miami. Critter 592, roger, turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 7,000. 270, 592. What kind of problem are you having? Smoke in the cabin. Roger.
Without an intercom system, a flight attendant entered the cockpit, requesting the oxygen masks to be deployed, but the pilot worried that the oxygen will further feed the fire. So, they didn't deploy the oxygen masks. A flight attendant then exits and leaves the cockpit door open, which allows the smoke to enter the cockpit. Captain Quebec throttled down the engines in an attempt to descend, but the left engine didn't respond and stayed on climb power, causing the aircraft to turn right. She counteracted by applying a full left aileron and left rudder, putting the aircraft in a tight turn back to the airport. Then, a flight attendant entered the cockpit again, telling both pilots, completely on fire, and leaving the cockpit. Both pilots realized that the situation is much worse than they thought. They knew if they can't get the plane back to the ground, it was all over. First Officer Hazen asked for the nearest available airports, probably knowing that the plane is unable to reach Miami. This was the last radio contact from Flight 592.
703. Critter 592, they're going to be standing by for you. You can plan where you want to when able direct to Dolphin now. Critter 592, turn left heading 140.
The toxic smoke likely incapacitates both pilots and everyone on board, leaving nothing besides the warning alarms and the air rushing against the plane. The radio messages from the tower had now gone unanswered. After staying in the air for almost 10 minutes, Flight 592 then banked to the right and nosedived to the ground.
Critter 592, contact Miami approach on corrections. No, you just keep by frequency.
Sync rate. Sync rate.
ValueJet Flight 592 crashed into Florida Everglades with a speed of over 700 km per hour. There are no survivors. The investigation by National Transportation Safety Board revealed that the oxygen canisters that I mentioned before were in fact not empty oxygen canisters, but expired oxygen generators. The oxygen generators, together with oxygen masks, are mounted behind panels above passengers' seats. The purpose of oxygen generators is to supply oxygen to the passengers if oxygen masks would be needed. As a passenger pulls on the oxygen mask, it pulls a firing pin on the generator, which provided enough energy to start a chemical reaction to create an oxygen, which then flows out of the container. Once activated, these generators can become extremely hot, reaching a temperature of more than 250 degrees Celsius, or 482 degrees Fahrenheit. And Flight 592 carried 144 of these inside these 5 cardboard boxes. How these generators were been loaded without anyone noticing? We need to turn back to 4 months before the disaster. On January 31, 1996, ValueJet bought 3 used MD-80s from McDonnell Douglas Finance Corporation, or MDFC for short. These aircraft were then ferried to Sabertech facility for the overhaul, which included the replacement of new oxygen generators. Those expired oxygen generators had been removed from these aircraft and stored. According to the MD-80 maintenance manual, a safety cap needs to be attached to the firing pin of these generators to prevent any accidental activation. But Sabertech didn't have any of these. Instead of covering them with safety caps, they simply cut cords attached to the firing pins or duct taped around the cans, then labeled them as expired, packed them inside cardboard boxes, and left them inside the warehouse without any marking and identification as a hazardous material. 3 days before Flight 592, Sabertech handed these boxes back to ValueJet, which were loosely repacked, sealed with tapes and bubble wraps, and labeled as empty on the cargo manifest. Then these boxes were been loaded into Flight 592 forward cargo compartment by ValueJet workers on the day of the accident. The ramp agent then entered the cockpit for flight crews to sign off on the cargo that was being loaded into the cargo hold, without even knowing the exact condition of the oxygen generators. Soon when Flight 592 began to taxi and take off, one of these improperly packaged oxygen generators had activated, accumulated heat, and set fire to its surroundings. Even the DC-9's forward cargo compartment was airtight, which means any fire that would occur inside will be burned out as soon as the oxygen was depleted. But the fire got its oxygen from these generators, defeating the cargo hold's airtight design. And without smoke and fire detectors, the inferno had gone unnoticed until the explosion of the aircraft tires. When they began to realize what went wrong, it was already beyond the crisis point. The fire then broke its way through the ceiling of the cargo hold and the flooring of the cabin, melting everything in its way, including all wiring and flight controls, which led Captain Quebec to lose all control of her aircraft before impact. As the result, there is no way for all 110 people to escape from the burning plane still in the air. The report had put blame on Sabertech for improper packaging and storing hazardous materials. ValueJet for not supervising Sabertech's operations. And FAA for not mandating smoke detection and fire suppression systems in cargo holds, as NTSB had recommended from the investigation of a similar accident in 1988, and for not appropriately monitoring ValueJet's maintenance practices or the airline's oversight of its subsequent contractors. After the disaster, Sabertech surrendered its operation license and went out of business. In February 1998, FAA issued revised standards requiring all Class D cargo holds to be converted to Class C or E, which have additional fire detection and suppression equipment before early 2001. For ValueJet? Well, FAA grounded an airline for 11 months, and when it did return to flying, it never recovered from the crash, due to heavy negative publicity and serious financial problems. ValueJet acquired AirTran Airways and later merged with it. But for years, the general public and media thought that ValueJet just changed its name and operated as AirTran, as it wanted to get away from its past. On the 10th anniversary of the Flight 592 crash, AirTran had not made any major corporate announcements out of respect for the victims' families. AirTran then operated until 2014 when it was acquired by Southwest Airlines. On AirTran's final flight, it used ValueJet's call sign, Critter, and fly on the same route as ValueJet had done when it began operation in 1993. Before you go, please make sure that you pressed like, share and subscribe to help me grow this channel ever more. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.